Hi, I'm Matt Geiger. My goal is to get you the full, unbiased story on issues, not the liberal story or the conservative story. The topic in this video is climate change, but to really understand the issue, we're going to start by understanding some history on how the science progressed and how US policy has been affected as a result. So we're going to start our journey in the late 1700s. That's around the time that America got its independence. Until that point, we believed that climate on Earth had always been roughly the same. That is, until scientists found evidence that our climate had actually changed significantly over time, what we now know as geological ages. Throughout the 1800s, scientists developed a number of theories on Earth's early climate, but by the 1870s, most scientists converged on the theory that we had experienced one or more ice ages on our planet. Now, at the same time, throughout that 1800s time period, studies were conducted on the atmosphere independently of the geological ages studies. Scientists came to the realization that the atmosphere kept the Earth warmer than it should have been, so they knew that there was some other force at work in maintaining our planet temperature. Scientists studied the warming effect of the sun and how it was amplified by a bunch of different gases, including carbon dioxide. As theories were simultaneously developing around the causes of the Ice Age, changes in gas content of the air was put up as one of those theories, among a bunch of others like solar variation. So now, in 1896, a scientist named Svante Arrhenius had a study published called On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air on the Temperature of the Earth. In that study, he calculated that cutting carbon dioxide in half would be enough to bring on an ice age, but also that doubling the amount of carbon dioxide in the air from industrial sources would increase the temperature by 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. But he actually thought that it would take thousands of years because of the pace of change at that point, and he actually thought that it would be a net positive to humanity on a whole. Throughout the early 1900s, climatologists and geologists looked into this theory deeper, and by the 1960s, most scientists were convinced that humans had the ability to seriously impact Earth's climate. But pollution was linked to global cooling, so the question was whether our activity would actually heat up or cool down the planet. They understood even then that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are associated with warming, but particulate pollution, like your smog and soot pumped out by industry, are associated with cooling. So two huge things happened in the 1980s. Number one, legislation had been passed to really reduce that particulate pollution. Specifically, amendments to the Clean Air Act gave the EPA the ability to set industrial standards. So net global cooling wasn't really a point of discussion among scientists anymore as a result of that. The second factor was probably even more important though. Scientists drilled ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica that confirmed that relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature, reinforcing the emerging scientific consensus. Throughout the 1990s, scientists refined their scientific models and used observational work to confirm the prior understanding of ice ages, and all this led to a developing consensus that human-induced warming was occurring. As a direct response, an international treaty was created in 1992 called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with the goal of stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic or human-induced interference with the climate system. In and of itself, this really didn't do anything, but it did create a framework for negotiating future international agreements, and we still use that framework to this day, actually. One of the major agreements, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, was a direct result of this framework. The Kyoto Protocol set specific limits on greenhouse gas emissions, and it was internationally binding on the signing countries. And that's what really set the Kyoto Protocol apart from other agreements before and since it. But it's also why the US never accepted it. Without the major greenhouse gas emitters on board like the US, China, and India, the Kyoto Protocol isn't really viewed as a success. There was another attempt a few years later. The Paris Agreement, negotiated in 2015 and signed by members in 2016, was basically an attempt to make up for the failure of the Kyoto Protocol. Specifically, the goal was to catch on with those nations that create most of the greenhouse gases, the US, China, and India. The Paris Agreement is essentially a promise that each country makes to create an individual target for greenhouse gas emissions. The agreement's non-binding, unlike the Kyoto Protocol. So, for example, the US has agreed to reduce their emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, and China's agreed to peak their CO2 emissions by 2030 at the latest. The interesting thing about the history of climate change is that it's just a relatively young issue compared to most other issues which we've been debating for decades, sometimes even centuries. This makes it even more important that we understand the scientists' perception of global warming. We're still constantly updating our understanding of global warming, and if we start listening to politicians at the expense of the latest science, it'll only close our minds. Thanks for watching.